The first curved panel of steel was heavier than it looked. Elias strained, his boots slipping on the dusty floorboards of the old barn, the muscles in his back and shoulders burning with a clean, honest fire. He was 20 years old, and the farm was his now, a legacy of silence and soil left by parents taken too soon by fever. All he had of them were fading photographs and the barn, a great timber-framed cathedral of a building filled with the ghosts of harvests past, and his grandfather's journals. He grunted, sliding the corrugated sheet another 2 feet across the floor, its edge screeching a protest against the wood. Boro, his old dog, lifted his gray-muzzled head from his paws, his intelligent brown eyes following the movement. A low thump of his tail against the floorboards was his only comment. He had seen Elias do many strange things in the months since the funeral, but this was the most peculiar. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He looked at the space he had cleared in the center of the barn's massive ground floor. It was a rectangle, 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, swept clean of hay dust and chicken feathers. This was where it would stand, his home, a house inside a house. He walked over to the workbench where a leather-bound journal lay open. His grandfather's handwriting, a precise and elegant script, filled the page. The entry was dated 50 years prior. The principle is sound, a shell within a shell, an air gap insulator on a grand scale. The outer structure breaks the wind and sheds the bulk of the snow. The trapped air between the outer and inner walls becomes a buffer, a thermal blanket that cannot be torn or saturated. In a land where the wind can kill a man in minutes, the most valuable resource is still air. A shadow fell across the wide-open barn doors. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Elias turned. It was Mr. Abernathy, their closest neighbor, a man whose face was a roadmap of 70 hard winters. He stood with his hands on his hips, his faded denim overalls covered in grease and dirt. His gaze swept over the stacks of steel panels, the bags of concrete, the strange collection of tools. "Building a house," Elias said, his voice quiet. Abernathy squinted, then let out a short, sharp laugh that was more of a bark. "A house? In here? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You've got a perfectly good farmhouse not 100 yards from here. Needs work, sure, but it's a house. This," he gestured at the steel, "is a tin can. You'll freeze solid come January." "I have a plan," Elias said, closing the journal. "A plan?" Abernathy stepped inside, the dust motes dancing in the columns of light he disturbed. He nudged a steel panel with the toe of his boot. "The condensation alone will ruin you. It'll sweat and drip all winter. Everything you own will be soaked in rust and ice. Wait until the first real cold snap. That metal will suck the heat right out of your bones. It'll be an icebox, son. A tomb." Elias didn't argue. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. He'd learned long ago that words were wasted on men like Abernathy. Proof was the only language they understood, and his was not yet built. "You're grieving, I know," Abernathy said, his tone softening slightly. "But this isn't the way. Sell the place. Move to town. A boy your age has no business trying to run this farm alone." "This is my home," Elias stated simply. Boro rose and came to stand beside him, pressing his solid weight against Elias's leg. Abernathy shook his head, a look of pity on his weathered face. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel drive. The warnings became a quiet chorus in the weeks that followed. Mr. Sterling, who owned the largest tract of land in the county, slowed his gleaming new truck as he passed, leaned out the window, and laughed loud enough for Elias to hear it over the sound of his cement mixer. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman who had known his mother, stopped by with a casserole and a worried frown. "Elias, dear," she'd said, her hands fluttering nervously. "People are talking. Are you sure you know what you're doing? It's not safe to be so isolated, especially if you're experimenting." "It'll work," he told her, accepting the warm dish. She just patted his arm, her eyes full of concern. "Please be careful. This winter is supposed to be a bad one." He knew. He felt it in the way the air was already growing teeth, in the early migration of the geese, in the thickness of the squirrels' coats. He felt it in his bones. That was why he worked from the first light of dawn until his muscles screamed in the violet dusk. He was not experimenting. He was following a map laid out by a man who understood the cold. The work was a slow, deliberate meditation. First came the foundation. He mixed the concrete by hand in a rented machine, the rhythmic churn and slosh a counterpoint to the chirping of crickets in the fields. He hauled the wet, heavy slurry in a wheelbarrow, load after load, his arms and back settling into a state of permanent aching fatigue. He poured a 4-inch slab, 60 feet by 30, right onto the barn's packed earth floor, smoothing it with a long 2x4 until it was perfectly level. Burro would lie just outside the perimeter, nose on his paws, watching the gray rectangle slowly take shape, occasionally sneezing at the cement dust. For 3 days, as it cured, the barn smelled of wet stone and possibility. Next were the ribs of the structure. He assembled the curved steel arches on the ground, each bolt tightened with a wrench that left deep grooves in his palms. Then came the raising. Using a system of ropes and pulleys his grandfather had sketched in the journal, he hoisted the first arch into place. It was a moment of quiet triumph. The perfect curve of steel against the angular, hand-hewn timbers of the barn felt like a conversation between generations. He bolted it to the foundation, his knuckles bleeding from slips of the wrench. Then he raised the next, and the next. 20 arches in total, spaced 3 feet apart. The skeleton of the Quonset hut rose within the cavernous barn, a strange, metallic whale beached in a wooden sea. Clara from the general store delivered a load of supplies one afternoon. Screws, insulation, and a special high-temperature sealant for the stovepipe. She wasn't from the area, having moved to town a few years ago, and she didn't carry the local burden of accepted wisdom. She pulled her truck up to the barn door and watched him for a long moment as he secured a panel. She didn't laugh. "That's a lot of work," she said, her voice clear in the still air. Elias climbed down the ladder. "It has to be done." "Mr. Abernathy says you're building a freezer," she said, not as a judgment, but as a statement of fact. "He's welcome to his opinion." She walked into the barn, her eyes taking in the structure. She looked up at the towering roof of the old barn, then at the lower, curved ceiling of the Quonset. She noticed the significant space between them. "It's like one of those nesting dolls," she mused, "one inside the other." Elias felt a flicker of surprise. No one else had seen it as anything but a singular, foolish object. "Something like that." "Why inside the barn?" she asked, her curiosity genuine. He paused, considering how to explain a lifetime of inherited knowledge in a single sentence. He settled on the simplest truth. "The barn is the first blanket," he said, gesturing to the thick oak timbers above. "This is the second." She nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. She understood. Not the physics, perhaps, but the poetry of it, the intent. "Well," she said, turning back to her truck, "I brought you an extra dozen washers. Figured you might drop a few." He watched her drive away, a plume of dust rising behind her truck. It was the longest conversation he'd had in a month, and the only one that didn't leave him feeling more isolated than before. Autumn bled into the landscape. The maple trees burned crimson and gold, then shed their leaves like a sigh. The first hard frost silvered the fields, and the air grew sharp enough to cut. Elias worked with a focused urgency. He sheathed the metal skeleton, each panel screwed into place, overlapping the one before it, the seams sealed with a thick black tar. The Quonset was now an enclosed space, dark and echoing. He cut openings for a single door and two small double-paned windows on the south-facing side, framing them carefully. Then came the insulation. He'd spent nearly all his remaining money on thick rolls of fiberglass batting and dozens of canisters of spray foam. He spent a week inside the hut, wearing a mask and goggles, meticulously filling every crack and crevice. He packed the walls with a foot of insulation, the ceiling with 18 inches. The acoustics inside changed. The sharp echoes softened into a dense, muffled silence. It was becoming a sanctuary. The centerpiece was the stove. It was a heavy cast-iron wood stove, squat and powerful. He positioned it in the center of the living space and began the painstaking task of installing the chimney. A triple-walled insulated pipe rose from the stove, passed through a fireproof collar in the Quonset ceiling, and extended up into the vast, dark space of the barn's upper loft. From there, it pierced the barn's own shingled roof, emerging into the open air. This was the most critical part. Any mistake could lead to a fire that would consume everything. He checked each connection 3 times, his work slow and precise. While he worked, he could hear the sounds of his neighbors, the distant buzz of a chainsaw as Abernathy cut more firewood, the rumble of Sterling's large tractor as he brought his cattle in from the far pastures. They were all preparing, reinforcing their own homes in the traditional ways, banking foundations with hay bales, nailing plastic over windows, cleaning chimneys. Their actions were a constant, unspoken criticism of his. His own preparations were different. He spent 2 full weeks just cutting and splitting wood. He felled dead ash and oak trees on his property, bucking the logs and hauling them back to the barn. The rhythmic crack of the splitting maul became the beat of his days. He stacked the wood not against the farmhouse, but inside the barn, along the wall opposite the Quonset. He created a massive, tightly packed wall of fuel, 10 feet high and 30 feet long. It was enough wood to last 2 winters, maybe 3. Abernathy saw the wood pile and just shook his head as he drove past on his tractor. "All the wood in the world won't keep you warm in a steel box," he muttered to himself. By mid-November, the project was complete. The interior of the Quonset was Spartan but functional. A bed in one corner, a small kitchen area with a hand pump sink fed by a line from the farm's well, shelves laden with jars of preserved vegetables from his mother's last garden, and a table with 2 chairs. And his grandfather's journals, stacked neatly on a small shelf beside the bed. He moved his few belongings from the cold, drafty farmhouse. The last thing he brought over was a small, framed photograph of his parents. He set it on the table. Burrow followed him in, circled 3 times, and lay down on a rug before the cold stove as if claiming his rightful place. Elias closed the insulated door. The silence was profound. The ever-present moan of the wind that rattled the farmhouse windows was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant quiet. He stood for a moment, just breathing. Then he knelt, struck a match, and lit the kindling in the wood stove. The first snow came the next day, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a promise. The sky turned a permanent leaden gray, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Elias installed 3 thermometers. One was nailed to the outer wall of the barn, exposed to the elements. The second was inside the barn, in the air gap, halfway between the barn wall and the Quonset. The third was inside the hut, on the wall opposite the stove. He began to log the temperatures in the back of his grandfather's journal. Outside, 35 degrees. Air gap, 42 degrees. Inside, no fire, 48 degrees. The principle was already working. A week later, the radio began issuing warnings. A weather system of historic proportions was descending from the Arctic. A polar vortex, the announcer called it. A once-in-a-generation blizzard. They forecast 3 feet of snow, winds gusting to 60 miles per hour, and temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, with wind chills approaching 60 below. All residents are advised to shelter in place, the voice on the radio crackled. Ensure you have enough fuel and food for at least a week. This is a life-threatening storm. Elias checked his woodpile. He checked his food stores. He filled extra containers with water from the pump. Boro grew restless, pacing and whining softly, his senses telling him what the radio was only just confirming. The air pressure dropped so suddenly it made Elias's ears pop. He went outside to make a final check on the barn doors, securing them with a heavy wooden bar. The wind was already a physical presence, status wall of moving cold that stole his breath. The sky was the color of a bruise. He retreated into the barn, the massive doors groaning shut behind him. The wind's roar was instantly diminished, muffled by the thick oak walls. He entered the Quonset and sealed the door. Here, the sound was even fainter, a distant, hollow moan. He lit a lantern, the golden light pushing Status the gloom. He loaded the stove with 3 seasoned logs of oak and adjusted the flue. A gentle warmth Status to radiate through the small space. The storm hit just after dusk. It did not arrive so much as manifest, the world outside dissolving into a screaming chaos of wind and snow. The old barn groaned and shuddered Status. Elias could hear the shriek of the wind finding its way through the tiny cracks in the century-old Status, a sound he had lived with his entire life in the farmhouse. But here, inside his metal shell, it was a filtered, distant rage. He sat at the table, a cup of hot tea in his hands, and listened. Boro lay by the fire, asleep and untroubled, his flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Hours passed. The storm intensified. A loud crack echoed through the barn as a heavy, snow-laden branch broke from the old oak tree outside. Elias stood and walked to the thermometers. He shone his lantern on them. The one outside, visible through a small peephole he'd drilled in the barn wall, was buried in snow, but the needle was bottomed out at its lowest reading, -20 degrees Fahrenheit. He checked the one in the air gap. The needle hovered at a steady 18 degrees above zero. The barn, porous as it was holding a pocket of air a full 38 degrees warmer than the outside world. It was the buffer, the blanket. He looked at the thermometer inside the Quonset. With the stove burning low, the logs barely smoldering, it read 56 degrees. It was warm. It was comfortable. He had used only a handful of logs to maintain a temperature 76 degrees warmer than the Arctic hell raging just a few dozen feet away. He sat back down at the table and opened his grandfather's journal. "The structure will hold," the script read. "The principle is sound." Elias traced the words with his finger. Sometime after midnight, a new sound cut through the storm's fury. A frantic, desperate banging on the main barn doors. Boro shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand on his back. He pulled on his heaviest coat, hat, and gloves, lit a powerful storm lantern, and went to the door. It took all his strength to lift the bar and pull one of the massive doors inward against the wind and the deepening drift. A figure, caked in snow, stumbled inside. It was Mrs. Gable's son, Thomas. His face was pale with cold and fear. "Our roof! A tree came down," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "It took out the chimney." The furnace is dead. We're freezing. Mom and Dad, they're in the car, but the gas is low. Bring them here, Elias said, his voice calm and even. All of them. He helped Thomas back outside into the blinding whiteout. They fought their way to the Gables house, a journey of 200 yards that felt like a mile. They found Mr. and Mrs. Gable huddled under blankets in their cold-soaked car, their breath fogging the air. Elias led them back, a human chain against the torrent. When he opened the door to the Quonset, the wave of gentle warmth that washed over them was so profound, Mrs. Gable began to weep. She stared around the simple, warm, quiet space, her eyes wide with disbelief. It's warm, she whispered, as if witnessing a miracle. Take your coats off, Elias said, handing her a mug of hot tea. There's soup on the stove. An hour later, there was another knock. This time it was Mr. Abernathy, his face grim, his eyebrows frozen white. His own chimney, an old stone structure, had partially collapsed, filling his house with smoke. He had managed to put out the embers, but his home was now unheated and unlivable. He had come to check on the Gables, having seen their lights go out. He stood in the doorway of the Quonset, his jaw slack. He looked from the toasty stove to the comfortable families, then at the thermometer on the wall. He slowly took off his hat. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice thick with awe. He looked at Elias, and in his eyes was the dawning of a profound and humbling respect. "You did it, boy. You actually did it." The last to arrive was Mr. Sterling. He had no phone line to call for help. His state-of-the-art generator, housed in a shed outside his large, modern house, had frozen. The diesel had gelled in the extreme cold, his pipes had burst, and his palace was rapidly becoming an ice rink. He had made his way through the storm to Abernathy's, only to find it empty. Seeing the faint lantern glow from Elias's barn, he had stumbled the last quarter-mile in desperation, his expensive winter gear failing against the sheer ferocity of the cold. When Elias opened the door to him, Sterling, the man who had laughed the loudest, could only stare. He was covered in snow, his face a mask of misery. He entered the warm space and sank into a chair without a word, accepting a blanket from Mrs. Gable. For a long time he just sat there, shivering, watching the gentle flicker of the fire in the stove. For 2 days the storm raged. Elias's Quonset hut, the subject of so much ridicule, became a sanctuary. 9 people, the Gables, the Abernathys, the Sterlings, and Elias, lived together in the small, warm space. Elias's vast stores of food and water were more than enough. The huge pile of firewood seemed endless. They slept in shifts on the floor, sharing blankets and stories. The social barriers of the community, wealth, age, experience, melted away in the shared, life-saving warmth. Mr. Abernathy spent a long time just looking at the construction, running his hand over the insulated walls, studying the way the stovepipe was vented. "The air gap," he kept murmuring to himself. "It's the damn air gap. All these years, just breaking the wind wasn't enough." Mr. Sterling, humbled and quiet, insisted on doing his share. He helped Elias bring in more wood from the stack inside the barn, his movements stiff and awkward, but his effort sincere. He watched Elias, this quiet young man he had dismissed as a fool, and saw a wisdom that had nothing to do with money or status. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the world was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible sculptural beauty, with snowdrifts burying fences and reaching the eaves of houses. The silence was absolute. From the door of the barn, they could see the devastation: collapsed roofs, broken trees, and the stillness of a world frozen solid. They were the only warm and safe people for miles. As the neighbors prepared to trek back to their damaged homes, Mr. Abernathy paused in the doorway. He turned to Elias, his expression serious. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Plain wrong. What you did here, it's not crazy. It's genius. You saved us. All of us." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, a lifetime of stubborn pride giving way to honest gratitude, and walked out into the snow. Mr. Sterling was the last to leave. He approached Elias and pulled out his checkbook. "Let me pay for the materials," he said quietly. "All of them. For this and for the food. It's the least I can do." Elias shook his head. "No, thank you, Mr. Sterling." "Why not?" Sterling asked, confused. "I can afford it." "It's a home, not a business," Elias said simply. He looked past Sterling, at the structure that had sheltered them. "My grandfather's ideas aren't for sale." Sterling slowly put his checkbook away. He seemed to understand. This was about something other than money. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice holding a new tone of deference, "anything at all, you just ask." The story of the blizzard of '58 and the boy who built an ark in his barn became a local legend. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Elias's farm became a focal point. People came not just for help, but to see. They walked into the barn, their boots crunching on the snow, and stared at the curved metal hut standing serenely in the middle of it all. They touched the walls, felt the lingering warmth, and asked questions. Elias, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, was quiet and reserved. It was Clara who helped him. She started spending more time at the farm, bringing coffee and helping to field the endless stream of visitors. She saw the stack of his grandfather's journals and had an idea. "You don't have to explain it to them," she said, her voice gentle. "Let him do it." Together, they carefully carried the journals to the table inside the Quonset. When people came with questions, Elias would simply open a journal to the relevant page, a sketch of the pulley system, a calculation of thermal mass, a note on wind dynamics, and let them read. He didn't lecture, he shared. The farmers and ranchers, practical men and women who dealt in realities, understood. They saw the careful drawings, the meticulous notes, the elegant logic. They took their own notes, made their own sketches. The ridicule was replaced by a deep and abiding respect. They stopped calling him "that Thorn boy" and started calling him Elias. They asked his opinion on things, not just on building, but on crop rotation, on weather patterns. They had discovered that his silence was not emptiness, but observation. That spring, Mr. Abernathy began building a smaller version of the Quonset inside his own hastily repaired barn to protect his newborn calves the following winter. Mr. Sterling funded a project to build a large, community-sized version next to the town hall, a designated emergency shelter for the entire region, built to Elias's exact specifications. Elias himself oversaw the construction, never taking a penny for his time. He was no longer an outsider. He was the quiet, steady heart of his community. His relationship with Clara grew as naturally as the wild roses that climbed the old stone walls of the farm. It was a bond forged not in grand romantic gestures, but in shared work, quiet understanding, and the mutual respect of two people who saw the world in the same way. They spoke of insulation and seed stock, of the future and the past, their conversations weaving a life together. They married a year after the Great Storm, a simple ceremony held in the meadow behind the barn. Years passed. The winters came and went, some harsh, some mild, but none ever matched the ferocity of that first one. The thorn shelters, as they came to be known, became a standard feature of the regional architecture. They saved livestock, then people, during ice storms and sudden blizzards. The knowledge passed from one generation to the next, a practical legacy of survival. Elias and Clara raised 2 children in the Quonset, which they eventually expanded and connected to the old farmhouse with a glass-enclosed walkway. It remained the warm, beating heart of their home. Boro grew old, his muzzle completely white, his steps slow and deliberate. He spent his final years sleeping on his rug by the wood stove, the same stove that had kept him warm through the worst of storms. One autumn morning, when the air was crisp and the leaves were turning, he did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the warm, safe house his master had built. Elias carried his old friend in his arms, the weight familiar but final, and buried him under the great oak tree that had lost a limb but survived the storm. He carved a simple stone, Boro, a good dog. The grief was a quiet, heavy thing, marking the passage of an era. Elias grew old too. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and his hands, though still strong, were etched with the lines of a life of hard, meaningful work. He became a quiet elder, a man people sought out for his patient wisdom. He never boasted about what he had done. When asked by younger generations about the great storm, he would simply point to the Quonset. "Actions have to speak for themselves," he'd say. "The rest is just noise." He and Clara lived a long and peaceful life together, their love a quiet, steady thing, like a low-burning fire. He died in his 92nd year, on a calm winter's night, in the same bed in the same warm Quonset hut. He passed in his sleep, with Clara holding his hand. The entire county mourned him. They buried him in the small family plot on the hill, next to his parents, and not far from where Boro lay. The town council, led by the grandchildren of the very people Elias had saved, decided to place a marker. They didn't put up a statue or name a street after him. That wouldn't have felt right. Instead, they affixed a small, simple bronze plaque to the weathered gray wood of the main barn door, right next to the spot where Mr. Gable had hammered in desperation so many years before. The plaque did not tell the whole story. It didn't need to. Everyone knew it. It read, Elias Thorne, 1938 to 2030. He listened to the quiet and built against the wind. Decades later, the farm was home to a new family, a young couple with a child who had moved from the city seeking a simpler life. The old barn still stood, its timbers silvered with age but strong as iron. The Quonset hut inside remained, its metal skin gleaming softly in the light filtering through the barn's high windows. It was still the warmest place on the property. On a cold November afternoon, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down, the young father took his daughter into the barn. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of old hay and seasoned wood. "Why is there a house inside the barn, Daddy?" the little girl asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. The man knelt and pointed to the space between the two structures. "Well," he began, his voice echoing the stories he had been told by the town elders. "The barn is the first blanket. It keeps the wind away." He then tapped the wall of the Quonset. "And this is the second blanket. It holds the warmth inside. A long time ago, a very smart man who lived here knew that the quiet air between the two was the most important part of staying warm." The little girl looked at the gap, then at the sturdy metal house, and she nodded, understanding the simple, elegant truth of it. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling around the corners of the old barn. But inside the double walls, all was calm. The structure stood. The warmth remained. The legacy endured.